Luckily, the end of the process was near. In 1944, as the Russian forces advanced into Poland, the SS started shutting down the concentration camps while trying to destroy any evidence they could. By the start of winter, the evacuation of Austria had begun. The camp was liberated by Soviet forces on January 27, 1945, earlier than expected. Mengele was one of the last to leave. On January 17th, he was transferred to the Gross-Rosen concentration camp in Lower Silesia. He took many documents and large amounts of his research, but much of it was left behind. The man we now know as Josef Mengele was born on March 16, 1911, in the southern German town of Günzburg. His father, Karl Mengele, was an engineer and the owner of a factory that produced farm machinery and equipment for cutting, sawing, and milling. Mr. and Mrs. Mengele, for example, household heads of these families, assisted 7 employees on the firm's record during the early 1910s. While Birga Hupfauer, Joseph's mother, later on, would give birth to 2 younger siblings of Joseph, known as Karl Jr. and Alois. Total War described the prevailing world that a young Joseph grew up in. Germany had not been independent for long. As late as the 1860s, the area was still divided into more than 20 small nations. But in 1871, these territories were incorporated to form the German Empire, with Prussia as its leader. This imbalanced the existing equilibrium in Europe, and towards the latter part of these decades, the entire continent was on the brink of war. In an attempt to suppress Germany from becoming dominant, the British formed a coalition with the French and Russian empires against the Austro-Hungarian Empire. At first, these powers kept their fighting within the limits of their continents, to parts of Africa and the Balkans. However, the quarrel in the Balkans erupted into a full-scale war in July 1914 within the European continent. It did not take long for this to include countries such as Japan. The First World War had thereby begun. For more than 4 years, the war was fought between Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire on one side, and Great Britain, France, Russia, and Italy on the other. The United States came along much later. The defeat of Germany precipitated the fall of the empire, and the new name given to the country became the Weimar Republic. More importantly, the Treaty of Versailles included a series of peace terms that were extremely harsh, especially for Germany, with long-term implications. Considering the extent to which these developments influenced the Mengele household, Amélie Mengele probably experienced some of those changes. The war broke out and Karl Mengele had to leave for the German army, taking with him only his rifle and leaving Walburga to care for the children and manage the business as well. She did so with an iron will and was able to secure a deal from the German authorities with Reichian Schmaus of the Forgewagen, a military truck meant for transportation during combat. Consequently, the company expanded and Karl Mengele was able to grow it further upon his return to Günzburg after the war. By the early 1920s, it became the 3rd largest manufacturer of threshers in Germany. The name Mengele is still recognized in the Günzburg vicinity, with Karl Mengele Strasse being one of the principal streets in the town. This imposes an interesting perspective regarding the public role of the Mengele clan and the monstrous offenses that would be committed by Karl and Walter Mengele's eldest son. The organization also requested support from other relatives of the family. Last but not least, the wealth that Joseph enjoyed during the 1920s made it possible for him to pursue studies in detail, because he was able to pay for them. Mengele was quite an intelligent boy. He was also a fine painter and began to love music as well as sports. Considering that this town is at the southern tip of the Bavarian Alps, it may be safe to say that skiing must have been his favorite sport. Josef Mengele sat for his high school exams in April 1930, where he received a fair grade, but nothing beyond that. Based on the chronology of events, this may have been one of the first instances in his life where he considered enrolling in dental school. However, when he learned that there were no dentists near his locality, he figured it would be a money-minting profession. After concluding that this field was too limiting, medicine, particularly its genetics and anthropology, became his area of specialization. There is extant correspondence from that time that shows he already had ambitions of becoming the first physician in the family, and thus a medical scientist, in order to fit in with the family. It was, therefore, Stockholm Syndrome that made him leave the family home in October 1930 and head east towards Munich, the capital city of Bavaria. He attended medical school and embarked on the study of philosophy here as well, which shows he was attracted not only to practical medicine but also, to some extent, the more abstract aspects of medicine and the breadth of research. The combination of these aspects would lead, in the end, to disastrous results. When Mengele stepped foot in Bayern, a new ideology was already on the rise in that region. A decade before, it was established that the National Socialist German Workers' Party, or simply the Nazi Party, came under the leadership of an Austrian by the name of Adolf Hitler. In Munich, in November 1923, a handful of World War I veterans were attempting to stage a coup. However, this had no significant success. They were especially determined in two things: preventing the rise of any communist-like parties and desiring an alteration of the anglicized and humiliating Treaty of Versailles that had ended the war. Their political ways and means had not succeeded at the ballots. This was due to the fact that people had not been ready until the fall of 1929. This shift occurred after a decade of phenomenal growth, during which no such severe losses had been experienced outright within the borders of the United States. When the economy turned sinister, social parties such as the Nazis and the Communists became popularized among the people during elections, due to an unprecedented number of unemployment, loss of wealth, and savings throughout the whole of Germany. Once the Depression set in after the Wall Street crash, Hitler's name, along with other available allies, gained fame in the early 1930s. Everyone was indulging in hate, making all sorts of assertions and propaganda about the elevated position of Germany as a power in the very center of the European continent. Later on in his life, Mengele would become a member of the Nazi Party more progressively, but even before he did so, the politics of his environment had already besieged him. In March 1931, he joined a veterans organization called Stahlhelms, after the names of helmets that German soldiers wore during World War I. The skirmishers, called the Stahlhelms, organized militant rallies and parades on a regular basis. However, it was Nazi politics that also attracted young Josef's interest early on. Years later, in his memoirs, Mengele wrote, "Nazi student action was aided by the older students who were of the voting age and above. When it happened, I was underage and could not vote. Considering familial reasons at that time, I guess my political views were nationally conservative. I had not been a member of any political party. Nevertheless, I was captivated by the whole structure and ideology of the National Socialists. However, I was still a poorly organized private individual at that moment in time. There was no denying that, if our homeland fought back the Marxists and the Bolsheviks' onslaught, one could not afford to keep quiet in such extreme circumstances. One must logically ask, how much more time would Mengele endure before joining the Nazis? The author states, "This simple political idea ultimately proved to be the most important in my fate." Mengele experienced firsthand the Nazi takeover during his adolescent years, residing in Munich. By 1932, Hitler and his cronies became the largest party in Germany, boasting more than 30% of the votes in that year's Reichstag elections and a whopping 40% in a later election. This still could not hold ground for a working majority government, and by the second half of 1932, the whole political landscape in Germany came apart. The problem was whether the country would turn to the more extreme communists, the second largest party at that time in Germany, or to the Nazis. Most probably, the Weimar Republic would also collapse with those in power. In the end, however, the political and business elite made a bargain with Hitler and the Nazis in the belief that they would be able to keep control of Hitler and his party. An arrangement was made to include him and some of his key associates in the government. This was a fatal miscalculation, and after allowing Hitler in, the Nazis wasted no time and began imposing control immediately. The Nazis engineered a political crisis to create the necessity of passing the Enabling Act, which was the law that allowed Hitler, in his capacity as Chancellor, to rule by decree. Therefore, the Nazis built a system of government that was dominated by a single party, which would govern the entire country of Germany for the next 12 years, almost entirely usurping control in just a few months in the first half of 1933. Although many of his colleagues later lamented that they considered Mengele to be just another mediocre student, by the year 1934, he was becoming more and more entrenched in his studies. Many people said that this compensated greatly for his quantitative deficiency, his intelligence. By the time it was the mid-1930s, Mengele's zeal had driven him to engage in working towards a Ph.D. while also practicing as a medical doctor. Not so long before that, the Sturmabteilung, or Brown Shirts, and the Stahlhelms, with whom Mengele had been associated for some time, came to coalesce, becoming the first paramilitary wing of the Nazi Party. The merger was ordered by Hitler, as he was suspicious of the underlying royalist strain within the leadership of the Stahlhelm. A chronic kidney condition forced Mengele to leave the group, enabling him to dedicate more effort towards his studies. In summary, he managed to obtain certain recognizance awards for his academic performance and achievement. Mengele wrote a dissertation titled Racial Morphology Studies of the Mandibula in 4 Racial Groups, which earned him a doctorate degree in the year 1935. Here, however, he maintained the position that it is possible to determine a person's race only by looking at his or her mouth and jaws. It must be emphasized, however, that, at this time, there were scientific disciplines that provided a basis for the assertions made by Mengele, and the thesis did not contain any blatantly racist or anti-Semitic content. This means that Mengele had not yet been radicalized, as much as he would likely be later. After completing his thesis and being conferred with a doctorate degree, Mengele served as a junior resident physician for some months as a compulsory service before the award of a full medical license. While already married, he met for the first time Irene Schoenbein, who would become his wife later, while on duty at a hospital in Leipzig. They would later get married in 1939. In 1944, their only son, Rolf, would be born. Although in his private life he was thriving, the life of a resident physician, with its tight schedules and ward rounds, was not for him. He had also wished to resume his education. In this respect, he applied for and successfully got appointed as a research assistant at the Institute for Heredity, Biology, and Racial Purity of the Third Reich in Frankfurt, a position that became available in January 1937. He would study under the instruction of Professor Ottmar Freiherr von Verschuer, a man who supported Hitler and was alleged to have expertise in the diabolical issue of racial hygiene. This stage in Mengele's life undoubtedly nurtured his vile views, and also brought his degradation to the peak. He had focused on genetics and race before this time, but his previous hypothesis was not overtly prejudiced. After a brief time in Frankfurt, where he immersed himself in Nazi racial ideology, he applied for membership in the National Socialist German Workers' Party, which he joined in May 1937 alongside 5,574,974 people worldwide. During the last years of the 30s, Mengele and von Verschuer were actively engaged in works, the origin of which was intended for the courts of law, which the German Chancellor was preparing for the persecution of German Jews charged under the Nuremberg laws, extreme anti-Semitic protection measures from the mid-1930s aiming to deprive Jews living in Germany of the right to vote. There were some medical contradictions on that matter. For example, the court would often bring defendants and check their genealogical origins with respect to Jewish ancestry, and then determine whether they had breached any of the Nuremberg laws. In one such instance, restraining an individual identified as Virginia due to her Jewish ancestry, Mengele and von Verschuer were directed to assess her physical characteristics, including the size of her nose, in order to determine if she possessed Jewish lineage. This is an evident break from the pattern of conduct associated with Mengele. He had carried out some work based in Munich, employing conventional scientific methods, and historians and other scholars have largely agreed that the products of that work would be seen as unproblematic even now. By contrast, in the late 1930s, there was a slippage into pseudo-scientific racial ideologies, which were invariably couched within the Nazi narrative. Most certainly the time he spent in Frankfurt changed him immensely. Frankfurt, in this regard, was Central Europe's business development center for Mengele, irrespective of his official position. In 1938, Mengele completed all his medical studies in Frankfurt and was subsequently introduced to the field by Professor von Vrachus, who took him in as an assistant physician. By this time, Britain and France had made it abundantly clear that they would not risk any more aggression, particularly where Germany sought to encroach on Poland. And that ultimately led to Britain and France declaring war on Nazi Germany on September 3, 1939, after Germany invaded Poland from the east on the 1st of September. The war was formally declared. Back in Europe, before the outbreak of a continent-wide war, Mengele's career had met its first and only major thorn with the Nazis. After being together for a few years, he had plans of marrying Irene in the summer of 1939. That said, there was some trouble concerning the marriage, with some even going as far as claiming that his intended bride was of Jewish lineage. Mengele's address book contained the names and addresses of a few influential friends and colleagues who told that board that Irene had very Nordic ways. Still, no amount of further research, including that of distant relatives within the paperwork reaching as far as the United States, stood clear of the problem. As a result, Josef was forced to ignore the issue, though he could not find facts proving she was not an ethnic Jew, a status which lessened his problem marrying her. The Nazi administration prevented the individual, who would soon be the most important arbiter of life and death on matters of racial purity, from obtaining a document declaring that his offspring were of pure Aryan descent. This is a morbid twist. With the outbreak of the war, Mengele's high spirits came back. His son, Rolf, would decades later narrate how his father used to refer to World War I as a conflict worth undertaking in order to restore a German nation mistreated for so many years. Mengele had joined up promptly, but his previously diagnosed kidney ailment came back in his late 30s, making it hard for him to enlist for active service until the summer of 1940, which was long after the savage onslaught of the German panzer forces in the western part of the continent. It appears that for some time they stationed him in a military region in Kassel, central Germany. He spent only a few weeks there before the Waffen-SS transferred him to combat duty, granting him the rank of officer in the SS as Untersturmführer. The next few months of his life were spent in Poland, where he was also employed in the genealogical section of the Race and Resettlement Office, dealing with the evaluation of potential colonists from Germany and their racial purity and fitness in Eastern Europe. Essentially, it was to expel the undesired elements from the Germanic expansion's Eastern European colonization. Stationed in Poland, Mengele's complicity assured the Nazi state of the success of its military campaign. Following the encroachment of Poland in September 1939, the Nazi regime rapidly advanced into and subsequently controlled the territory. Then came a strange period in history that can be compared to an official waiting period before the outbreak of the Second World War. In the winter and early spring of 1939 and 1940, there was a sort of lame duck phase as France and Britain sought, a bit late in the day, to strengthen their armament against an anticipated onslaught from the Germans. Hitler was being very cautious in his approach, so it was only by the spring of 1940 that he decided to annex Denmark and Norway. Nevertheless, the operations to capture France in early summer resulted in the complete takeover of the northern parts of the country and the Low Countries in a number of weeks. To be precise, by the summer of 1940, almost the end of the year, Great Britain was the only known opponent of Nazi Germany. Italy, under the leadership of Benito Mussolini, aligned with Germany, headed by Hitler, and exacerbated the situation by trying to control British-held North Africa and particularly invade Egypt's heavily guarded Suez Canal. That prospect seemed plausible in the summer of 1941, when both Germany and Italy, which formed the Axis powers, had occupied several parts of Europe, including the Balkans. For Winston Churchill and other members of the cabinet in London, by the middle of 1941, it was a very bleak and despondent outlook as far as the war effort was concerned. Greater in scope and consequence for the Nazis, their ally regime would pursue even more aggressive and sinister policies. Hitler and the Nazi Party at the helm were eager in their belief that all of Europe would be under their reign very soon, and no nation would interfere in matters concerning them. Hence the consideration of taking their anti-Semitic policies an extra notch higher. The plan proposed in 1940 and early 41 was the forced deportation of the millions of Jews present on the continent of Europe to a prison without bars, which was to be the Malagasy Island off the east coast of Africa. However, when the North African campaign started to stall and there was the threat of failure, with the decline in the chances of seizing the Suez Canal, a more extreme plan began to take form. The final solution was a plan that sought to expropriate the remaining Jews of Europe and confine them to the many concentration camps that had been set up throughout Central and Eastern Europe from the very beginning of the war. There, a couple of hours after reaching the given spot, the healthiest individuals would die from the gas. A few would be used as laborers in factories making war goods for the Germans. The mass extermination of the inmates in the camps was put in place, for example at Treblinka, Sobibor, and Auschwitz, after the strategy was approved on the 20th of January 1942 during the Wannsee Conference that took place north of Berlin. Mengele was destined for the same section soon enough. In 1941, Mengele was predicted to take part in some campaigns. In mid-1941, Mengele was sent out to the Eastern Front after spending a good amount of time in Poland. After the victory of his party in 1940, Hitler instructed his generals to start working on the invasion of the USSR. As it turned out, Operation Barbarossa would become the greatest land army containment ever initiated by an army. As the summer unfolded, enormous German military forces, numbering in the hundreds of thousands, made their way across the border into the Soviet Union. The campaign against the USSR began with enormous success, since vast territories of Leningrad and Moscow were occupied by the German Wehrmacht, while Soviet troops retreated. Even so, Joseph Stalin and his generals were able to gradually gather their forces after all. But winter in Russia came all too soon. Most of the German soldiers did not use cold weather uniforms. Hence, in the winter of 1941, the German offensive barely progressed beyond Moscow and altered the scope of the war. This year, Mengele participated on that front, mainly in Ukraine, for which he earned the Iron Cross Second Class. Mengele volunteered for the Eastern Front. However, it was clear that Germany was to lose this war sooner rather than later. In January 1942, the Waffen-SS assigned him to the Viking Division's Medical Corps. Soon, however, this crack unit would advance deep into Russian territory, further than any other German military formation. Nevertheless, the unit did not allow Joseph to get anywhere near the combat. Since he was attached to the unit, the force's evaluation of him was that of a valuable reserve, and so he was kept away from taking part in the maneuvers and attacks where the junction was advancing, but remained in defense when the junction was retreating. In July, they sent the Viking Division into a bloody 5-day attritional engagement around the towns of Rostov and Bataisk. He was awarded the Iron Cross First Class, the most coveted award, during this battle for rescuing 2 wounded soldiers trapped in a burning tank under enemy fire. After saving the 2, Mengele rendered first aid to them. In addition, he was also given a medal for his services for the people of the Germans and a black award for the injured. And so it came to be that Poland saw the return of Mengele in 1942, a decorated soldier who fought valiantly on the Eastern Front. Most probably, commanders investigating Mengele's return to Poland would not grind out a theory of convenience where he was performing duties at his country as a reward for active combat. This explanation is more plausible since he seemed poised to make a return to the Eastern Front during the 2-year period when Professor von Verschuer, his benefactor, assumed the directorship of the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute in Berlin. The institute was the People's Führer and Eugenic Research Center. After this, and with the establishment of the concentration camps to implement the final solution, gulags furnished more than enough subjects for such studies and tortured more researchers above any morality and ethics. When von Verschuer made his arrangements to go to the concentration camps in the summer of 1942, it was already indicated that several former students and colleagues were going to be taken by him. Otto Mengele was indubitably among these men, and in all likelihood he advised von Verschuer to arrange for the recall of Josef from the Eastern Front in the summer of 1942. Thus, no later than January 1943, Mengele had made it back to Berlin and the Institute after a short trip to Poland. Yet, it would not be long before he was transferred to the infamous Polish concentration camp called Auschwitz. As everything proceeded, the defeat of the war effort was becoming more and more clear to any German looking at the situation with strategic egoism. As the Battle of Stalingrad drew to a close in an utter tragedy for Nazi forces, the Russian strategy of gradual but persistent repulsion of the German forces further into their own territory proved to be effective. Furthermore, the combined forces of the Axis powers in North Africa, particularly the German and Italian forces, were beaten by Britain in the early spring of 1943, to which U.S. also joined following its entry in the war in December 1941. In the summer of 1943, the Western Allies engaged in an event dubbed Operation Husky, which referred to the invasion of the island of Sicily, thereby commencing the establishment of a southern front on the continent of Europe against the Axis powers. Then 1944 came, and it saw the D-Day landings on the warm beaches of Normandy, France, which constituted the creation of a new Western Front, even as the Russians further advanced in pushing the Germans towards Poland and Ukraine. There was no denying that the Allies were going to prevail against Nazi Germany, but it was left to be seen how fast Germany would go into hiding, and which of the Allied sides would be the first to land in Berlin. The fate of these people in power depended very much on the importance of the further prosecution of those in high positions within the regime. A month later, in May 1943, Mengele, who had already been promoted to captain and Hauptsturmführer, was sent to Auschwitz. A place known as Auschwitz was created very soon after the German invasion of Poland. However, by 1943, it became an enormous facility under the command of its notorious leader, Rudolf Höss. It consisted of 3 camps. The first camp, known as Auschwitz II, was the location of the headquarters, barracks, and several of the first purposely built prisons. Simply put, Auschwitz II, popularly called Auschwitz-Birkenau, was a death or extermination camp. The Nazis exterminated not just Jews and their children, but also Romanies and other prisoners of war in showers filled with poisonous gas, Zyklon B. Subsequently, crematoria on the premises incinerated the corpses within the shortest possible time. This death factory would claim the lives of almost 1 million people, primarily Jews, between the years 1942 and 1945. The last of the camps, famously called Auschwitz III, or further Auschwitz-Monowitz, was a labor camp engaged in the production of synthetic rubber for the German chemical conglomerate IG Farben. Mengele reported to this vast camp in the summer of 1943. Upon reaching Auschwitz, he was given the position of chief physician of the Gypsy family camp by the CMO Edgeworth Worths. His responsibilities within the bigger camp were brutal and numerous. Medical professionals were essential in performing the selection at Auschwitz. This procedure was administered to new inhabitants of the complex. Upon arrival at the camp, thousands of Jews, Soviet POWs, Romani, and other unfortunate people had their physical examinations performed on the ramp next to the train platforms. The stunned arrivals, or newcomers, had no grasp of the fact that the doctors who were assessing them were sentencing the majority of them to death. They picked out a few individuals who seemed healthy enough and sent them to toil in labor camps. The rest were put aside for testing or alternative studies, and they were all fated to die within minutes of their arrival in the gas chambers. It was obvious how uninterested Mengele was in this matter. Many physicians on the staff of Auschwitz resisted the imposition of selection upon them, meaning the act of jugging people in stasis to choose who would die, usually the frail and young. Nevertheless, on the rare occasion that these circumstances arose, Mengele would willingly step in to perform the selections, even on his day off. Mengele's subsequent activities were in stark contrast to the pain that people experienced. This began almost immediately when he first took up his position in the Romani family camp. A few weeks after his entry into Auschwitz, the Romani camp was stricken by an outbreak of Noma. Noma is described as an aggressive, gangrenous condition whereby the primary pathogen evokes necrosis of tissues due to a lack of perfusion, occurring primarily around the mouth and lips. Contrary to the responsibilities of a physician who should have focused on the needs of the patients, Mengele was rather interested in the ill-defined investigation of this ailment. Symptoms were recorded in study rooms, and patients exhibiting them were isolated. The most shocking part was that many children with the disease were slaughtered, their brains and tissues removed, and sent back to the SS medical facility in Graz, Austria, for further studies. Long before this grotesque experiment could end, orders for the disbandment of the entire Romani camp were issued on the night of August 2, 1944. Other atrocities took place. There was a general shortage of sanitary facilities, which, coupled with the overcrowded trains used to transport the convicts to the extermination camps, meant that most, if not all, of the arriving population at Auschwitz were already sick. Consequently, a plethora of illnesses infested the colonies, leading to an increase in diseases such as typhus and scarlatina. Mengele's methods for addressing these outbreaks can only be described as extremely brutal. For instance, whenever typhus broke out, Hitler would just order the 600 Jewish women in the barracks where the outbreak occurred to be sent to the gas chambers. Then, the barracks were purged, and hundreds of fresh occupants were brought in. Upon their arrival, they were issued new clothes, and delousing was performed. This process was carried out in every barrack. Strangely enough, it was because of these activities that Mengele received the War Merit Cross and the post of senior first physician of Auschwitz-Birkenau in 1944. This was not an isolated case. There are many records of Mengele gassing hundreds of victims at once to prevent outbreaks. He was particularly ruthless toward the Roma people at Auschwitz. However, his most vile act was, without a doubt, the proclamation of the extermination of tens of thousands of Jews around the end of 1944, when even the camp's food supplies, scarce at only 700 calories daily for the inmates, were no longer enough to sustain them. Mengele sanctioned the killings of numerous people at Auschwitz and carried out inhumane techniques for addressing ailments. But it was his experiments at the camp that have rendered him the most controversial figure. Even prior to the war, in the 1930s, he had done extensive work on genetics and imagined Auschwitz as a large laboratory where he could continue such work. He considered the prisoners at Auschwitz to be disposable subjects for his experiments, much like a chemist views the chemicals in their laboratory. His keen interest was in studying individuals suffering from issues such as heterochromia, iridum, and dwarfism. His methods were harsh, more often than not. At one time, he conducted an experiment to stimulate iris pigment production in polychromatic individuals through chemical means. During his studies, he had people killed, or killed them himself, by opening their aortic arch and obtaining their skeletal remains for archiving and investigation of internal organs. Torture was common, even when he decided to keep paralyzed corpses intact for later expositions of the supposed glory of his craft. More unsettling were the more than one instance where Mengele made incisions to remove the organs of certain subjects without the benefit of anesthetics. Surgery on the kidney was so brilliantly executed that the patient was even allowed to return to work soon without any medication for post-surgery pain. Most famously, Josef Mengele is known for his experiments on twins, which were of particular interest to him due to his passion for genetics and other related fields. The actual carrying out of this selection saw Mengele actively searching for twins to use in his tests. The selection was the process of selecting new arrivals on the gangway nearest the camp train station. Usually these children came as a pair, but records indicate that two nearly 70-year-old twins were also examined by Mengele. In the summer of 1944, which coincided with the mass extermination of 400,000 Jews from Hungary, Mengele supposedly located and studied around 175 pairs of twins at Auschwitz. Strangely, it seems that being a twin often aided individuals in escaping the clutches of death at Auschwitz during that time. Twins who were subjects of Mengele's experiments also received better nutrition than almost the entire remaining prisoner population in the camps, and most of the people he selected in this manner would have otherwise been sent straight to the gas chambers. Rather than putting them all in the same uniforms, regardless of the fact that they were children, Mengele would allow them to keep their own clothes and even kept their heads unshaven. The same patterned investigation included making extensive measurements of the twins. Sometime later, it was confirmed that Mengele's work was exceedingly detailed. The shape of the skull and other facial angles of the twins were attentively recorded by Mengele. An Auschwitz survivor later recalled that the doctor spent nearly 2 hours measuring the eyes of herself and her twin sibling. Over the course of several months, exhibition examinations were performed every 2 or 3 weeks by Mengele, who also took photographs. This was likely done because he wanted to observe any changes, however minimal, that occurred within the same pair of identical twins with respect to their position in relation to each other, identical versus non-identical twins. But this was not all. Mengele regularly inflicted pain on one twin to see how the other responded. He conducted experiments on all test subjects by giving them substances and chemicals without any medical justification. The worst of all was that he routinely executed sets of twins by administering doses of chloroform and then proceeded to study their bodies with special attention given to the organs of the twins. Once, he murdered a set of Romani twins, one of whom he believed was suffering from tuberculosis, even going so far as to carry out an autopsy in order to prove his point. Unfortunately for Mengele, it became clear that the imagined scenario was false. The kids did not actually have TB. The most astonishing aspect of it all was how readily and easily Mengele psychologically distanced himself from the act of killing people. After the war, even some of the Jewish doctors who were used as lab assistants for Mengele at Auschwitz testified that he was rather friendly towards the twins and other subjects of experimentation. He would bring them sugar, sweets, and would ask how they were doing. Regardless, he could exterminate them in a matter of seconds as if it meant nothing. It was quite clear that Dr. Mengele's obsession with his research exceeded any moral barriers. Furthermore, the ideology of the superiority of the Aryan race, combined with his thorough schooling under Nazi beliefs, made him think it was justified to kill people of so-called inferior races, as long as it was for some scientific cause that would favor the Nazis. What happened was absolutely dreadful. This was a man who, only to study human organs again, was cutting into the people he'd just finished murdering a few moments earlier, while singing Italian songs. It's not surprising that the physician became nicknamed the Angel of Death while in Auschwitz, due to his frequent participation in the selection and his experiments being known to the general public. His stay there was short. By the middle of February, he had to flee again to avoid the advancing Soviet army. This marked the first leg of a futile race against the enemy that was closing in on him. For the next 3 months, Mengele moved farther and farther west, desperately trying to escape. He reached Sudetenland, Czechoslovakia, around the first days of May. He must have known that on April 30th, 1945, Eisenhower's forces had occupied Berlin and Hitler had committed suicide. Soon after, the Third Reich was commissioned to surrender. The commander-in-chief of the German forces, Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, signed the final act of surrender of all German armed forces in Berlin on May 8th, marking the end of World War II in Europe. In the post-war period, Mengele's life was in extreme danger. In the years following the end of the war, the Allies took a relatively mild approach toward Germany. However, the leadership was prepared to prosecute certain individuals for war crimes, especially those who belonged to the SS and were in charge of the death camps. Mengele was one of them. He knew he had to stay one step ahead of those trying to arrest him. He returned to Germany on the evening of May 8th, just hours after the end of the war had been announced. This time he disguised himself by wearing the uniform of a simple German soldier, hiding his rank in the SS. For weeks he managed to evade capture. He narrowly avoided being detained in mid-June when he, along with 10,000 other German soldiers, was singled out for questioning. Nevertheless, ultimately he did end up getting detained as per the American division that concluded the operations of his unit. What ensued was astonishing. Mengele was an alias to which he responded, and it was the same as the one on his identification documents. Inexplicably, though, the officers who were interrogating him did not make a connection between the Mengele in front of them and the Angel of Death, infamous for Auschwitz Nazi concentration camp. In April of 1945, Mengele had been announced as one of the fugitives at large with the highest profile in the authorities' pursuits. Nevertheless, Mengele also eluded the law. Before being apprehended in the fall of 1945, he remained in security for a number of weeks, bouncing around various jails. The fact that he was not tattooed with a blood group like most of the SS officers is what is believed to have kept him out of jails. In 1938, the year he joined the paramilitary group, Mengele rejected the offer where he would don a short-colored version of its sin, a sleddy. Such a decision guaranteed that he would not be subjected to physical engagement with the organization. He exited Ingolstadt town towards the end of September in 1945 and relocated to Diego Wirth. During this time, every town and village in the nation was occupied by American and other Allied forces, who routinely stopped German citizens to interrogate them. Thus, he began calling himself Fritz Ullmann, using some documents which once belonged to his namesake friend. Later, he altered these somewhat to Fritzhollmann. After another brush with death, he departed from Donauwörth for the Russian-controlled parts of eastern Germany. At this moment, he was able to let his wife, Irene, know that he had managed to remain hidden and was avoiding capture. A lot of queries had earlier been directed to Irene Mengele regarding the whereabouts of her husband, and this marked the beginning of a period of increased movement for Mengele within post-war Germany. He was not entirely in control of his faculties at that time. How odd that a couple with whom he stayed in the latter part of 1945 remembered him saying that he had done his best for the betterment of the conditions in Arbeit macht frei, and that he wanted to surrender the next moment he could get a proper court. He came back to southern Germany and settled there in early winter 1945, beginning work as a farmer in the foothills of the Alps. Fritz Hollmann was employed by the Fischers in this area. Mengele referred to the Allied soldiers as the Crusaders who had invaded Germany. He would get infuriated very easily when discussions touched on the post-war settlement. This made the Fischers suspect that their new tenant was a fugitive. He soon re-established contact with his wife, and in the subsequent months she made secret visits to him from time to time. This was how he lived for a few years, while the Allies continued conducting patrols, searching for him. These efforts, however, were often poorly organized. In the same way, many other top Nazi criminals, who were responsible for wartime atrocities, simply went off the radar after the war ended. Many believed Mengele was dead, as there was no record or confirmed sighting of him. By 1949, Mengele made up his mind to leave Europe. A variety of means were used by the Rat Line, an underground organization friendly to Nazi supporters, to extricate the last remaining Nazis who had been in hiding. Zugwart staff escorted Mengele through Germany into Italy in mid-April 1949, and he traveled to Genoa in northwestern Italy. He procured a document from the Red Cross under the adopted identity of Helmut Gregor, and that summer he traveled to South America. Several Latin American states saw aiding German war criminals as an act of defiance against the United States and its neo-colonial designs on Central and South America. In this case, the Argentine government was especially hospitable to the Nazis due to the conflict that existed between the regime and the United States. Moreover, prior to the war's end, a lot of money and resources had been funneled to Argentina by the Nazis. Because of this, many individuals managed to live, more or less freely, in that country after 1945. As a result, individuals such as Mengele and Adolf Eichmann, two of the principal perpetrators of the Holocaust, were able to stay in Argentina without being molested for an extended period of time. It was at the end of 1949 that Mengele first took up residence in Buenos Aires. The years thereafter, however, were devoted to little else other than continuing the South American expedition he had started. Before too long, he found himself working as a traveling salesman, selling farm implements, items he fondly remembered from the Fischer's farm in southern Germany. He shared living arrangements with a supporter of the Nazis before settling into a pad located in Buenos Aires. Once again, some funds from a German relative were dispatched through Argentina, arriving just in time for him to take up shares in an enterprising carpenter's business and a rental house soon after. It is also possible that during his entire stay in Buenos Aires, he was practicing medicine in the shadows. As evidenced by various papers, Mengele was said to have been in charge of organizing illegal abortions. His family situation had also changed. Even after the dreadful times in Auschwitz and the subsequent years, Irene, Mengele's wife, stayed loyal and refused to leave Germany for South America. After they parted ways in 1954, Mengele married for a second time 4 years later to Martha Mengele, his brother Karl's widow, who had also previously been married to him and traveled to South America where he was residing. It was this lack of zealous pursuit that enabled Mengele to visit Europe and see his son briefly in the mid-1950s before returning to Argentina and reclaiming his real identity. During those years, Josef Mengele was not being actively sought after, which explains why he was free and undetected. By the end of the 1940s, both the Allied powers and German leaders had reached the conclusion that Mengele was dead. This was the case even though Argentine authorities had become aware of the issue. In 1958, this culminated in the questioning of Mengele and other medical practitioners by Argentine authorities, although they did not prosecute him, regarding a case involving abortion doctors. However, the situation caused Mengele enough stress that he chose to move yet again. He undertook several moves in the latter part of the 1950s and early 1960s within South America, making a short stay in Bolivia and living in Paraguay for some time. His precision and cunning allowed him to escape arrest once again in the summer of 1960. Mossad, Israel's intelligence agency, burst into the house of Adolf Eichmann in Buenos Aires in mid-May of that year. They had received intelligence on Eichmann's location and were also interested in arresting Mengele, but he was in Bolivia at the time. After returning to Israel, Mossad put Eichmann on trial, perhaps the most vividly portrayed trial of Nazi war criminals since the Nuremberg trials of 1945 and 1946. In 1962, Eichmann was punished and hanged. In 1960, Mengele narrowly escaped capture thanks to luck and a politically motivated circus. Simon Wiesenthal and other Nazi hunters would later ascertain that the elusive Mengele had lived an everyday life in South America, but for some reason he quickly returned to the Federal Republic of Germany. He later settled in Brazil, living on a farm previously owned by a Nazi sympathizer, Wolfgang Gerhard, located outside São Paulo. His second wife, Martha, took residence in Italy for a short period before traveling to Brazil. In these years, Jacob and other associates of the Israelis were busy hunting down Mengele in Latin America, aiming for his imprisonment and deportation. Thus, it was difficult to establish Mengele's exact location at any given time. In 1962, Mossad received a report that he had stayed in Egypt at some point. It is impossible to confirm whether this is true, but for a considerable period, Mengele resided in South America discreetly, thanks to the protection of Nazi sympathizers like Gerhard and Geza and Gittestammer, two Hungarians. In the course of the decade corresponding to the 1960s, he was assisted by those methods in deploying further so-called shelters in the area of São Paulo, Brazil. When Gerhard came back to Europe to seek medical help for a relative, with their help, Mengele assumed the identity of Gerhard. Josef Mengele would never have to pay any penalty, for whatever crimes he may have committed or was accused of. After leading extremely poor health for several years, he died on the 7th of February, 1979. He had already been suffering from high hypertension and other ailments, and even a blood clot in 1976. Surprisingly, when it took place, he was reported to have died due to a second stroke while swimming in Bertioga, a coastal town in Brazil. He, however, was reported to have died due to drowning. He was among the most sought-after Nazi war criminals, who spent the longest time on the planet since he had already clocked 70 years. In addition, he received a visit from his nephew Rolf, who saw him in São Paulo, about 2 years before the onset of this story. This was the first time in his life that he met his father after reaching adulthood, and the last time he saw the man for close to 2 decades. The recollections he would later pen of his father portrayed a man who, more than 30 years after the conflict, expressed no guilt over his deeds, and explained that what he did in Auschwitz was simply what he had to do as an SS officer. Ultimately, however, the attitude of Josef Mengele towards his father was quite straightforward. He was an unrepentant Nazi. This tale of his fleeing from justice has one more twist. There were Nazi hunters such as Simon Wiesenthal who maintained the fiction for quite a long time that Mengele was still alive and would be brought to justice someday. Until 1985, when the intelligence services of Günzburg, Germany, got hold of a series of letters written by him, the public had no idea that Mengele had died many years ago. Brazil set out to investigate the mystery of his gravesite. These efforts bore fruit, and it was quickly established that Mengele's final resting place was in Embu das Artes, São Paulo, Brazil, assuming the name of Wolfgang Gerhard, the person who had sheltered and assisted him long ago. In the summer of 1985, the authorities exhumed his corpse, and forensic testing figured out it's most probably the skeleton of Mengele, a fact that was also supported by Rolf Mengele. Its remains, though, were never buried. At the present moment, the medical school of the University of São Paulo employs the remains of a man who once killed and worked on the insides of corpses in Auschwitz for educational purposes. So how does one describe someone like Josef Mengele? Clearly, as we have noted, he was a monstrous human being, controlled completely by reason, and devoid of any compassion for the living humans he was terrorizing through research or out of humanitarian considerations, even to the extreme of doing research in order to create a vaccine against a disease rampant in the concentration camp of Auschwitz. A study of his metamorphosis into a figure infamously known as the Angel of Death would also be interesting. Prior to 1937, when he became a member of the Nazi Party, the young man under analysis was an intelligent medical student who specialized in the study of facially distinguishing characteristics for anthropological purposes, and this was the case until the mid-1930s. He was said to have been quite the convivial person, with some researchers asserting that his early career was actually quite harmless. It could have been appreciated as a proper piece of science between the war's intervals, and not one filled with biases or hatred toward people. In this light, Mengele can be compared to Albert Speer, the architect who later turned into the Minister of War Production for Germany, even before he joined the Nazis. In contrast, they both belonged to the middle class and were qualified professionals with prospects ahead of them before the Nazis came into power, and their vision became even wider after collaboration with them. The idea of extermination camps or anything associated with mass murder had not been in either one's past. However, Mengele's demeanor was presentable until he became a member of the Nazis in 1937 and began attending classes on the study of race in Frankfurt under Ottmar Freiherr von Verschuur. By the year of our Lord, 1938, he was already an active member of the Order of Waffen-SS, a few of the many paramilitary organizations of the barbaric Nazis, and also of the NSDAP party. Come September 1939, when Poland was invaded, he was eager to assist in the war in this capacity, and already in one of his early publications, he expressed views on so-called race purity. The most interesting and the most horrible began during the summer of 1943 at Auschwitz and finished right after he departed from the camp as of January 1945. For nearly 2 years, Josef Mengele was responsible for, and in many instances, assisted with, the mass murder of hundreds, if not thousands of individuals. Mengele performed experiments on human beings, which can be described as unethical and downright bizarre. One of his experiments was joining together 2 people into one, which included the concept of conjoined twins. A few days later, their injuries turned gangrenous, and they died. While being a prisoner in Auschwitz, one can say that even at that moment he foresaw death. But in the end, Josef Mengele managed to escape ratification. For over 30 years, he was moving from one hiding place to another in different countries, with easily understood exceptions of some visits to Europe. There is also an astounding number of people who would defend a person responsible for the same atrocities as Mengele did. He was, however, lucky. The Allies managed to capture him in 1945. They, however, let him go because he did not have the standard blood group tattoo, which almost all the regular SS personnel had. Then, and even after those years, he managed to dodge arrest a few more times, the most significant being the year 1960, when Adolf Eichmann was captured in Buenos Aires. Because of this, most people did not bring charges against Mengele during his life, though his actions will be recorded in history. What are the feelings towards Josef Mengele? To what extent were his actions the most cruel and merciless of the Nazis, and what happened to him in 1937 when he started appearing as another person? Please tell us what you think in the box below. In the meantime, I would like to thank you for watching.